So, your objectives for this section. Recognize the major sources of evidence for evolution. There's a lot of different things that we're going to talk about. Again, I already talked to you guys about how evolution, being a theory, would have to have a lot of evidence to support it. That's what it means to be a theory in science. Right? It's not something that we speculate on. It's something that we did speculate on at one point, but now we have so much evidence to support it, and there's so little evidence to contradict it. In fact, there's no real evidence to contradict it yet, that we definitely think that this is taking place. We definitely think this is true. It's just like your theory of gravity, right? Every time I throw the pen up, it's going to come down. Every time you look at the stars and watch things move in the sky, we can predict those with math, with models. And we know exactly how they're going to move and where they're going to be tomorrow. So we have a theory of gravity that's pretty sound, pretty solid. We know how it's going to work because we have a lot of evidence to support it and no evidence that contradicts it. So it is a pretty strong case for evolution. There's a lot of evidence to support it, so we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to talk about some features that reveal the history of the species. When we get to the pattern of features, that's when it's going to talk about analogous and homologous. You have to be careful because some things are misleading, right? Just because something is similar superficially does not mean that they're actually related to each other, at least not closely. Whereas a lot of the evidence that we use is not superficial, it's underlying. So there's no confusion there. That is actually evidence that something's related if you look at something that's underlying versus just superficial similarities. Right? Just because a wasp and a bat and a bird, all three of them can fly, does that mean that they're all closely related? No, that's just a superficial similarity. That doesn't mean that they're related. But you can look at other things to tell you why a bird and a bat might be more closely related to each other than the bird and the insect. Right? So we're going to talk about a lot of different things. Start off with just fossils. Remember, we didn't even start thinking about evolution until we understood that the Earth was really old and that it changes. And that there are these things that you can find that no one's ever seen before. Right? No one's ever seen a dinosaur before, but we have evidence that they existed at some point. So we have fossils to work off of, first and foremost. And this is where a lot of evidence comes from, but also a lot of things are missing. Right? Remember, we're assuming that two things are related to each other. We don't really have concrete evidence there that they're definitely related, but we can basically make a logical conclusion that they're probably related to each other, because if you have this modern day armadillo, isn't know what an armadillo looks like?
It's like home.
I've never actually seen one in real life. Has anybody seen one?
Yeah, I've seen it on Reddit.
Where at? Zoo or in Texas or wherever?
Actually, it was in Texas.
In Texas. But anyway, you have modern day armadillos, D all the way over here. And you might wait until I'm done drawing this before you put anything in. But there is fossil evidence of something that looks like an armadillo, but instead of being a small 5-pound, 10-pound animal, it's like 300, 400 pounds, and it's gigantic, right? It'd be bigger than I am.
This is the one that's...
So we have this fossil over here at A that looks similar to this thing over here, but they're also very, very different at the same time. But again, when we talked about evolution already, does A change into D overnight?
No.
Hopefully not. And probably more likely there are little tiny changes over a really, really long period of time that makes that horse's neck really long and you have a giraffe now, right? So the big thing with fossils is we are assuming that A and D are related to each other, but it's easier to make that conclusion, to draw that conclusion, when you can find things in between. Right? So A could turn into B first and become just a little bit more similar to that D at a time. Right? So there's lots of steps to the process. A changes into B, B changes into C, and then finally C changes into D. Right? If you could find a sequence of fossils that had small changes, it'd be much more reasonable to conclude that those things are actually related to each other. And we have found that for some things, not for all though. sometimes we have, obviously, D, because it's still alive. We have A, and maybe when we have B, but that one's missing. And we can't find it. Does that mean that it didn't exist?
Not necessarily.
No. But does that mean that it does exist? No, not that either. But that being said, just because it's missing doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that it didn't exist at some point. So we do have what a lot of people like to use as counter evidence for evolution. Missing links, right? We're not sure how A and D are related to each other. Much easier to prove that they're logically related to each other if there was something in between. But we do actually have a lot of these missing links. But it's counterintuitive to a certain extent. Some people think that that's evidence against evolution. But that's not necessarily the case. If you understand anything at all about how fossils are formed, it makes sense that some things are missing. And it's not possible that all living things that ever existed would turn into fossils. Those things have to die in very specific ways to end up being a fossil. You don't die and become a fossil automatically. You had to die and fall face first into some mud and silt for that process to even start.
And it's really lucky if they find like a full.
Yeah, and finding a full skeleton even is really difficult. Even if it is partially fossilized, you're not going to find all of it usually. It's just the way it is. So not all living things leave a trace. And they're not necessarily supposed to. 99% of things that die, 99.99% of things that die don't become fossils. So to assume that every organism that ever lived, there's at least one fossil for that exists, maybe. But have we found it yet? Have we looked everywhere yet? No. So you can't really assume that it's not real, but at the same time, you can't say that it's real if you don't have it. So I understand why some people think that that's evidence contrary to evolution, but we actually expect these things. That's not actually something that scientists concern themselves with, because they know logically that not everything that lived is going to leave a trace like that. Not everything that ever lived is actually going to become a fossil. So although you might think that missing links are a problem, those are an expected problem, and most scientists don't concern themselves too much with that. They're not worried about that. It's not evidence against evolution. It's not necessarily evidence for evolution either, don't get me wrong. But it doesn't mean that there can't be evolution. It just means that we don't have that example right now. We don't have that fossil. And we may never have that fossil to continue that link all the way. So we're trying to track these changes over time. We don't assume that this 400-pound armadillo turns into a 10-pound one overnight, nor do we assume that that horse changes into a giraffe overnight. Right? We don't assume that either. But we have to have lots of evidence in between, and we do have some of the evidence. We just don't have all of it, and we don't expect to have all of it. Other things with fossils, and we'll do a lot more with this later, but this is just basic logic. So this drawing that I'm making is just supposed to be layers of soil.
I just have to say, if you've ever been like to a city or someplace, and there's every once in a while there's a human being that just looks so strange. I mean, they just don't, and I've often wondered if that person were to be fossilized with somebody in the future, think we all look like that. That's always crossed my mind.
Weird way to think about it.
What?
That is kind of weird to think about it that way.
I've always
But they also, I've read or seen in videos and things like that if a Neanderthal actually was alive right now and in this room, you wouldn't really know the difference between him and anybody else in this room.
Really?
So that being said, just because you look the same doesn't mean you're exactly the same thing either. But law of superposition. I'm going to actually start with an analogy on this first because it just makes sense to do so. So let's say that I get ESPN, the magazine, every month, or Sports Illustrated or something weird like that. I used to get Sports Illustrated when I was a kid. But if you got that every month, and you read it and you throw it in a pile, and you guys can kind of see how I organize things in my life. So yeah, they do end up in piles, right? And then later on, I'm thinking, I remember reading that article about Tiger Woods. I wonder if I could find that, right? And I go to look in this pile, right? If I read this a year ago, not yesterday, where would I be looking?
Bottom of the
Probably at the
pile.
bottom of the pile, because logically speaking, those are the oldest.
Well, it depends
And the ones at the top are the youngest.
Piling is stacked.
It does depend on how neat that stack is. It also depends on whether you have someone who might disrupt that at some point or another, because maybe Tucker throws all his things in a pile, but then Brock comes in and mixes them all up just to mess with them, right? So it doesn't automatically mean that that's going to be the oldest at the bottom, but it's a very safe assumption, especially in terms of soil and how soil forms from the bottom up, right? If you find logically A down here, a fossil of A way down there, and then you find fossil B up here, which one is logically older? Probably A. Now, does that mean that it's always going to be older? Not necessarily. Because B could have existed down here but didn't make a fossil at that time, right? But there's other logical explanations too. How could A actually be younger than B and we're being misled?
Things shift or something.
Because things change. Brock might have gone in there and dug it up and then put it down lower where it wasn't supposed to be, right? Animal activity actually is a problem for fossils because dogs like to dig up bones, right? And we like to dig things up when we're excavating to build a building, and then you look in that pile later and you have no idea where it was, but you find this bone, this old fossil, and you wouldn't know where it was in the soil originally, but there it is, right? So animal activity, but there's also natural occurrences. You could have an earthquake that shifts this and changes things. You could have erosion come in and take place because maybe B is found here, but we found A south of town about 12, 13 miles next to that river that's running down there, right? And you could actually logically assume that there's been some erosion that takes place near that river. And so just because A is close to the surface, that does not mean that it was always close to the surface, right? There may have been soil there that's been eroded at this point. So you have to be careful when you look at something like this. But we do actually use that law of superposition to assume how old organisms are. But then we also use much more technical data at the same time. We can use carbon dating to figure out how old something is. And even if we can't date the living thing because there's no carbon left, we can date other rocks that are nearby with other elements that decay, like uranium. So we can actually tell how old something is, and we can actually prove it with some science. But usually we're just going to assume how old something is, but we try to make sure that we eliminate those other possibilities because we don't want to assume, but it's the easiest way to figure out how old things are. But again, even if B was around down here, you don't need to add that to your picture just because it might mislead you. But even if B was down there, you might be able to assume that A was older, but even then, you probably shouldn't. You just know that B lasted a lot longer than A did. And so it could have been just not there. It might actually be the same age. It just was much longer living in terms of the species than A was.
Or maybe it survived like a big thing that happened.
Again, much longer living than that A was. And C might be in here somewhere, but remember C didn't form a fossil, so who knows? It could be here. We'd be really confused if C was down here and B's up here, and we're trying to figure out how this goes in order, because logically C should be here in between B and D. So that would be very confusing if we found it down here, but maybe we're just never going to find it because it never made a fossil. Maybe it existed right here. Maybe it never existed. We don't actually know. But we're going to use some basic assumptions. A is probably older than B because it's lower down than B is. Now, if you saw C the way that it is, you wouldn't know if it's the oldest or the youngest or what. Right? You might assume that D is the youngest because D is up here and it's still alive. You might find some D in this layer too because obviously some version of that organism has died at some point or another in the past. So you might find these ones together. But you have to use some logic to piece this together, and this is part of it. Right? That law of superposition is what we go off of first, and then we try and find other evidence to make sure we know how old those things are, and if we are sure that that's the actual sequence that they go in. Geography stuff. This has to do with that Galapagos video a little bit. Page. Because if I draw it on this board, then Aspen obviously can't see it. But we just watched a video a couple days ago that had these separate islands on it, right? And every island had its own unique environment. Now, when we're talking geography, there's a couple of different things that you need to look at. You need to make sure that you understand the difference. There's a subtle difference that I'm going to talk about here. You need to know what I'm talking about, hopefully. You got islands A, B, C, D, E, right? And in that video, they talked about how all these different islands had different finches, right? They had different beaks depending on what they ate and what was available in that environment that they lived in. But you have to be careful with that. That could be evidence, geographical evidence, because they're separated, they're on different islands, right? That things evolve and they end up matching their environment, right? They adapt to cope with their environment and change to their environment. But that being said, just because most of the birds found on B have that bigger beak because they need to eat the nuts or seeds or whatever that they can find there, versus the birds on E that have those small little beaks because they're usually trying to eat insects and things like that. That doesn't mean that a bird with a small beak couldn't be born on B and then just fly to E, right? They're not very far away. So there's no actual proof in that context, in those examples, that there isn't just variation in the species, and whichever beak it has, it migrates to the island that's appropriate. And there's no telling that, you're not saying that every bird that's born on B is going to have the same beak, because that's not necessarily true. They might have a different beak and then just end up on E eventually and live there. And yeah, it would make it more likely that those that are born on E would have the smaller beak, not the bigger beak. But that they don't necessarily have to have that beak to survive, because they have the option of moving to a different island. So it doesn't necessarily drop out of the population. That trait doesn't. But there is a difference between the finch example, which technically could work without any adaptation, evolution explanation at all, and the tortoise example. Remember, a tortoise that was found on island B may have had that arch-shaped shell, right, so that it could reach really high to get to its food, which was actually a disadvantage on island D, because island D had all this growth and underbrush that if it had an arching shell, it couldn't get through, it'd get stuck and it'd just die there, right? So it needed the rounded, smoother shell so that it could get through the underbrush and get to where it needs to go and not get stuck and just die there. Whereas this one over here wanted that arch so it could reach and get whatever it needed. But there's a difference now. Unlike the finches, what's not possible?
Them moving between the islands.
They're not going to move back and forth. You may not know this already, but there's a difference between a tortoise and a turtle.
One can't swim.
And the main difference is one can't swim. A tortoise can't swim, a turtle can. So if this tortoise that's born over here with the wrong kind of shell can't just decide to move over here, because it can't swim. Unless you wanted to pick it up, put it on a boat, and take it yourself, it's going to be stuck where it's at. Or unless there was some crazy tidal wave or something like that that actually did literally throw it from one island to the other. That'd be pretty lucky for it, but more likely than not, it just drowned in that situation, not hit an island at all. So B can't move to D. D can't move to B, so if they're born with the wrong shell over here, it's the same problem. Now you actually do see strong evidence for evolution, for adaptation. Because it's not just important that things are separated, physically, but they also need to be isolated. There needs to be no way back, right? So the key here is actually this isolation. Without isolation, you don't really know if they're adapting and evolving and changing to that environment the way you think they are. Because if it's the finch example, technically they could just fly wherever they wanted to, and it really wouldn't matter to them if they were born with one kind of beak or another. So although the finches are used as an example, and they are actually probably an example of, there's other explanations for them too. They could move from island to island, whereas the tortoises can't. They were a better example because of that isolation. There's no way for them to move back and forth. They can't swim, right? How did the tortoises get there to begin with? These are islands in the middle of the ocean.
Oh,
You can posit that. Do you have any evidence for it though?
Life finds a way.
Probably mutated.
Evolution.
What's a logical explanation? Mutation from a turtle, from a sea turtle, that climbed up on that island and was like, kind of like it here. There's lots of food. So, not saying that any other explanation could not be true, but saying that this is the only one that has logic evidence that could support it, then you would assume that, right, isolation, evolution, things change, right? Maybe it was a turtle at one point. Now it's not. Right? But who knows how that actually happened? We're probably never going to know how that actually happened, but there are logical ways that you can think about it, and there are other ways that you can think about it. You can believe things without having evidence, right? And that's not the point. The idea is we think that this is how it works in science because there's evidence that could support that. And we could actually feasibly prove that if we got enough evidence. But anyway, the big thing is isolation. Without that isolation, if they can continue to move back and forth, then you can't know that they are really adapting to their environment. It might just be normal variation within that population already, and then they just move to where it's useful, right? Because we have variation in our population, and some of the taller guys end up playing basketball, and some of the shorter guys are really good wrestlers, and whatever. Doesn't mean that they had to be good at something or another to survive. The other example, actually, the one that Darwin actually did use, could be a good example because it was a bird again, but he wasn't comparing mockingbirds on the islands. He was comparing a mockingbird he found on the island and one that he found on the mainland, right? So there was a mainland species way over this way, and I can't draw that in perspective here, but the odds of one of those things migrating and moving from the mainland to be not very good, right? They're just shooting out in the middle of the ocean, no idea that there's an island there or not. So the chance of that happening is much, much smaller than moving to an island that's within sight, right? That'd be really easy for a bird to do. But getting from the mainland to island B and vice versa is actually very difficult and likely impossible for that bird. Right? The first bird they got there very likely did just get blown off course in a storm and end up out in the middle of the ocean. But hey, there's some land. Right? But past that, it's not very logical to assume that they could migrate back and forth. So those birds would be isolated. That mockingbird would be isolated. Because there's not much reason.
Unless they were doing it for a reason.
Even birds that do migrate long distances, they don't do it over water, right? They go from Canada to South America to the equator over land the whole time, right? They're not just going striking out in the middle of the ocean and hoping that they'll make it to where they're supposed to make it to without dying in the meantime. That'd be a pretty improbable trip back and forth. So the mockingbird is a decent example. The finch can be a bad example, technically. Although the tortoises are a pretty good example. Again, some just basic points that I was trying to point out there, trying to get you guys to understand. Hopefully you do understand it. We can test somebody here real quick. Just in case. So Tucker,
No,
Tucker, why were the finches possibly a bad example of evolution adaptation?
Because they could fly from island to island.
They're not, what keyword?
They're not isolated.
They're not isolated. They may be separated. They might be living on different islands, but that does not mean that they're isolated. They can move. They're free to move. And we'll talk about that later. As long as two populations are technically capable of moving back and forth, individuals moving back and forth, you should not see any significant change in that population overall. But if they are isolated, it's a good example. Right? So on the other hand, somebody's got an easy one here. Caitlin, why are the mockingbirds a good example? They're birds too.
Because they wouldn't just fly out in the middle of the ocean and you can't see anything.
So although the migration is technically possible, is it really logical to assume that they do that very often? No. So they're separated by enough. They're definitely isolated. If you see differences on the island versus the mainland, that probably is due to adaptation, due to evolution, to different environments. And again, the different beaks here probably do have a little bit to do with their environment. Because I'm guessing if a bird's on B, it stays on B. And it mates with another bird that's on B already. And both of those probably have the same kind of beak already. So it's very likely that those populations are homogenized. They don't really have little beaks being born over here and then moving over this way. But it's still technically feasible that that could happen. So you can't discount that possibility. They are technically the same species. There's no reason why a bird from B and a bird from D couldn't mate and reproduce. So you're going to have mixing of traits still. But the tortoises, there's no mixing. There can't be. They can't get from A to B. Or from B to D like we're doing there. Biogeography, basically study of distribution of organisms around the world. Examples that are non-Galapagos related. There are, here's my terrible drawing of the Earth. There are actually New World monkeys and Old World monkeys. Hopefully you're aware that, if this is the Atlantic Ocean right here, that we're considered part of the New World because, our ancestors migrated to here across that ocean, and this is the Old World. So if you find monkeys in Africa versus monkeys in South America, they can be significantly different from each other. We would assume that they're related, but there are huge differences. Where do the monkeys in South America live? In the trees, in a rainforest, where there's nothing but trees, and there's nothing on the ground anyway. Even if you wanted to go down to the ground, there's nothing there for food or anything else. So they're in the trees exclusively, whereas in Africa, that's not necessarily the case. They live in the savannah. They run around on the ground. They rarely go up in the trees. So does anybody know a trait that a New World monkey has that an Old World monkey does not have?
Climbing, like a good tail.
It's the tail.
Yeah.
Right? It's a prehensile tail that can actually grab onto a limb. Some Old World monkeys have tails, but none of them have prehensile tails. Most Old World monkeys don't even have tails, or at least they're small tails, not long ones that maybe you could grab onto a branch with. Whereas the monkeys that live in the New World, they all have that prehensile tail, and that makes sense because of their environment. Right? So it's another example. There's a lot of different things that you can look at with that, but that's one of the ones that we're specifically going to talk about in the future.
So then were gorillas considered Old World then?
Gorillas are not necessarily Old World if they're found here, but they're also not monkeys. Gorillas have their own part of the primate, tree. Right? Monkeys are monkeys, but there are two versions of monkeys. There's the Old World and there's New World. But we don't consider ourselves chimps either, right? Just like we're not going to consider a gorilla a monkey, or a chimp a gorilla, or a chimp a monkey, or a chimp one of us. Right? So they're all distinct groups. But technically the monkeys, right, there are a lot of similarities in those populations, but there's one extreme difference. And so we do think that they're more closely related to each other than they are to any of the other primate groups. But yes, you would find gorillas in the New World, just like you find us in the New World. And we don't have tails at all either, right? But that doesn't mean the same thing as in context. Otherwise, embryology stuff. These ones are weird, a little hard to grasp at first, but it should be fairly logical too. You guys know what crabs and barnacles are? You know what a crab is, pretty easily, right?
Barnacles are like the things in the sea.
Barnacles end up stuck to things permanently, right? That's one of the major differences. They will stick themselves to a boat or to a rock or to a living thing sometimes.
Don't they look like
But they don't ever move. Right? They can't walk around like a crab does. They don't have claws like a crab does. They do actually have fins that they kind of reach out with and grab onto stuff as it floats by in the current. So that's how they eat, is they collect stuff but they stay in one place, whereas the crab will go to find the food. It's a completely different thing. And no one would confuse these things as the same species. But even marine biologists, somebody who study these things exclusively, cannot tell the difference between a crab and a barnacle when they're in their larval form. They are absolutely identical as far as the way that they look. You could look on a genetic level and tell that they have different DNA, but you would not be able to tell which one's which until they develop into their adult form. You have no idea which one's which. You could have a bunch of them mixed together and they could all be crabs, some of them could be barnacles, they might all be barnacles, but there's no way to know until they actually grow up. So although the larvae are identical, some could be crabs, some could be barnacles, but that actually does tell us something about those two species. Since they are so similar, at least at that stage in their life, there's a pretty good chance that they might be related to each other. Because there's no other reason for them to be so similar, because a shrimp is not that similar to a crab at that point. Right? And neither is a lobster. So all of those things being crustaceans, you might think that these two are more closely related than any other two that you might point out there. But it comes from how similar they look when they're larvae. Again, we're talking from my perspective, we're pretty lucky that any of us would know the difference between a crab and a barnacle. Let alone, all of us in this room could look at a shrimp and a lobster and a crab and a barnacle at a larval stage, and we probably think they were all the same thing. But we're talking to people that are experts and know what they're supposed to be looking for. They can't tell the difference unless they look at DNA. Otherwise, we have the same issue down here, a similar issue. Embryos of vertebrates are pretty similar to each other. Now, vertebrates include a wide range of organisms, including us. Right? What does a vertebrate have?
Spine.
Backbone, with that spinal cord going through it, right? But that would include us, but it would also include a shark, and it would include a tiger, and it would include snakes, and it would include birds, it would include a lot of organisms. Now we're going to cut out, we might want to cut out, things that don't have live birth because they might develop a little bit differently. So sharks technically lay eggs or with their fish. But, if you get outside of that group and start looking more, but even including them, you could look at a whale instead. And you might spell it right. Isn't it W-H?
Yes.
I was close to spelling it wrong and I corrected myself.
Whale
But
without
anyway.
H is the place.
Okay. But anyway, those three things. When you look at them as embryos, they all look very similar. In fact, they all have gill slits. Again, I just said cut these guys out. None of these have gills as adults. A whale breathes out of a blowhole, right? Just like you breathe, you just don't have a straw that goes out of the back of your neck, right? But these three things have what look like gill slits, the same as what those developing fish have, right? So you could have left a shark in there from that standpoint. But all of these things also had tails. Only two of them have tails, as adults. Usually, I don't think any of you have tails, but I mean you couldn't. But when you look at embryos of vertebrates, it's really hard to tell which one's which. You could confuse a human's embryo with that of a dog, with that of a whale, with that of a donkey, with that of a squirrel, with that of any embryo, because embryos are really, really early stages, right? You barely have a lump of a thing that looks like it might be anything at all. There's a very small amount of cells there, and there's not much differentiation that's happened. Remember when we talked about stem cells? These are all embryonic, right? They could be almost anything at this point, which is why they can turn into wildly different things at that point, again, too. But the embryos of vertebrates are really, really similar, so we would assume that all vertebrates are related to each other. Do we think that all vertebrates are as closely related as crabs and barnacles are?
Probably not.
No. Right? Those things are not vertebrates, so they don't get jumped into this group. But I'm pretty sure that a crab and a barnacle are more closely related than us and a shark, and us and a tiger, and us and a whale. Fairly confident in that because none of those things are even primates to go along with our specific part of the whole system. But crabs and barnacles, being the larval stage is way, way past an embryonic stage, right? They're already developed quite a bit at that point. They're not quite adults yet, but it's not the earliest possible stage like this is, basically. So this indicates less relation than this. Right? If you looked at an embryo, if you looked at a fetus of a tiger and a lion, you probably wouldn't know the difference at that point, right? But then once they are adults, you can definitely tell which one has stripes and which one doesn't. Well, like that's hard to tell. But early development, things that are more closely related would look more similar to each other. Very, very early development, you might see broad relationships. Because we don't think that we're closely related to whales, but we know that we could be related to whales because we share traits, the backbone at least. And we're probably more closely related with the whale than we are with a crab. And that just makes sense. I don't care that a crab lives in the ocean just like the whale does. Doesn't mean that they're more closely related to each other than we and whales are. So it depends on what you're talking about. We are probably running out of time now.
About solid 2 minutes.
I think that's probably a good place to stop for now.